I have, since running my own business, been fascinated with salescraft, or the process by which people buy things. But I don't do a lot of content about sales and marketing on my channel because it's not my core focus. I'd write about it every other day if I could. However, I have for a number of months been talking about this idea, which I think is hugely important, about how businesses are changing their buying behavior in 2023. People seem to like this idea, so I thought I'm going to do a video on it. After all, whatever your business is, you still need to sell. There is a fundamental difference between how Gen X and Millennials buy. This is becoming a major issue in how complex B2B sales cycles operate, and also has some big impact on certain types of sales, particularly on consultancy. The reason why this is an issue today is that as time marches ever onwards, the average age of senior leadership staff within SMEs shifts generationally. When I started my career, boomers were running businesses, although I wasn't aware of it at the time. So the process and philosophy of how those businesses bought was considered through the generational lens of how boomers thought. Then for a while, on average, Gen X were the senior leaders, and today we're seeing a shift where millennials, now in their mid-30s, are having their seat at the board table in businesses and are dictating how the buying process works within that business. And because there's so many more of them, they're dictating how that process works generally. Key to this is this theory of mine in that millennials do not buy advice. So if your core offer is advice-based, e.g. consultancy, or your sales engagement process is advice-led or consultancy-led, millennials have no time for this, and you have a problem. I think there is a huge change in how millennials buy, and this can be boiled down to two factors. Firstly, millennials were raised when the internet was a thing. Someone born in 1990 had the internet when they were starting school. By the time 2002, 2005 rolls around and they're 12, 15 years old, the internet is everywhere. Secondly, millennials were educated in a way that was much less paternal and encouraged a sense of self-belief, which was very different to how individuals were educated before. Gen X, on the other hand, and in this video we're talking just about millennials and Gen X because that's where the difference is. You can lump boomers in with Gen X and Gen Z and millennials if you want. We were brought up in a world without the internet and in a school environment that was far more paternal. Building a business is at its core a job of business process engineering. You have to find a bunch of resources and configure them in a way such that when those pieces are working in concert, a functional business model emerges. The first difference between Gen X and millennials is that Gen X were raised such that access to resources needed to build a business process required negotiation with the other humans. For example, in my first job, I sold CD-ROM software and I had to have someone fax over a catalog, and to buy the software, I had to spend half the day on the phone with our account manager in the US, placing an order that would ultimately be shipped. I wasn't necessarily negotiating on price, but I did have to negotiate the transaction over the phone with my counterpart. They had access to something I needed, and the only way I could get that resource was to interact with them and negotiate for that resource. Millennials grow up in a world where resources are always accessible through online catalogs, and the whole procurement process can be done completely digitally. In that process, human beings do not serve as gatekeepers into the procurement process. Millennials have, since their starting business, been able to find and assemble the resources needed to engineer their business processes without negotiating through other humans. The other thing, though, comes down to how paternal the world is when looking at Gen X versus millennials. I grew up in a world where elders, particularly men, knew things and decided things, and I, with all the other Gen Xers, were raised to believe that if you don't know the answer to something, someone older and more experienced than you does, and that if you wanted to know that thing, you'd have to convince them to tell you. In the educational environment, everything was done in it was very different. It wasn't Victorian, but it was still done in that quite Victorian fashion. You went through the course learning things by rote and had to demonstrate your capabilities to a teacher, i.e. the teacher was the elder person who gate-kept the information and would validate you as knowing that information as well. My first experiences at work were the same as my dad's experiences at work. I had an older male boss who knew the answer to everything, and my job was to kind of learn how to come up with the same answers myself. If the answer to something was not known, the default thing to do was to find an older person who did know and who would tell you the answer. In B2B sales, the people who might know the answer were very often external to the business and would need to sell you a service in. This is where we get consulting from as an industry. It's a belief that you just can't work things out yourself. That old adage that a consultant is someone who borrows your watch to tell you what the time is comes from somewhere. They gatekeep information and you need to pay them to get it. But it comes from this belief that you do not know the answer to that yourself and you can't work it out yourself. You have to get someone to tell you. If you have a shift where, particularly in education, rather than punishing pupils for not knowing the answers, you give them the message that the answer is in them somewhere and that the teacher believes in you and is nurturing you and can help you find the answer, that breaks the paternal model. And that's the basis on which millennials were educated. Millennials were taught that you can probably figure it out if you keep plugging away at it. Add into that as well the increase of group work in schools, i.e. lumping a whole bunch of kids together and telling them that you as the teacher believe they know how to work out the best way to do it. And everyone in that little peer group has something to contribute, but no one is kind of an elder statesperson who knows and gatekeeps the information. Everything is within that group. What you have is a bunch of people who believe they can work out for themselves what to do, and that the answer they come up with is probably good enough. Bringing those ideas together, you have Gen X who learned that A, to gather resources, you had to negotiate with other people, and that B, someone older and more experienced than you knows the right way to configure those resources, compared to Millennials who learned that A, to gather resources, you need access to an online catalog, and guess what? There are millions of online catalogs selling everything on earth, and that B, they can work out the answer on how to assemble those resources themselves. You end up with a fundamental shift in how buying works, particularly in complex B2B sales. Old school B2B sales is inherently paternal in nature. In Gen X, the customer starts believing they don't know the answer to the problem they have, but they can easily be convinced that someone external to the business does, because they've been brought up to believe the answer is always outside and needs to be brought in. The salesperson steps in as the paternal role and does enough to demonstrate they do have the answer. The Gen X customer is also historically predisposed to want to buy from a human being as it's more natural, even if buying online is more convenient. Therefore, a sales-led consultative approach works really well with Gen X because all the cards are stacked in the favor of the salesperson. In millennial land, the customer starts off believing they don't know the answer, but is convinced they can work it out themselves because they have always been able to work it out themselves. The salesperson has no credibility here because the millennial customer fundamentally doesn't believe the salesperson knows any better than they do. They have an equal chance of working out the same solution. Then, to a millennial, buying via a human is not natural and actively less convenient than buying online. So why would they want to negotiate that resource or do that sale with a person? The consultative salesperson, in reality, has no role in selling to a millennial senior leader. This is where you get this B2B buying behavior from, where the customer is working everything out through researching online and only comes to the salesperson when they have a few answers left that they can't satisfy through their online research. And this is just for buying normal things. When you're selling advice, i.e. consultancy, the situation gets much worse because millennials fundamentally do not believe in a two-speed system where one bunch of people have no idea what's going on and need to be told the answer, and that another bunch of people do have the answers if only they could be convinced to enlighten that first person. Millennials will work it out and come up with a good enough solution. The difficult thing about this, if you sell consultancy, is that they do work it out and the solutions they arrive upon are good enough. Someone with 20, 30 years experience might look at what they're doing and want to throw up because it looks wrong or feels wrong, but these solutions do work. And that can be really difficult to accept. And I know this because this is something I've personally struggled with for a long time, hence why I've been talking about and developing this idea for most of this year. Where this is really hard in 2023 is that a whole load of Gen Xers who've worked 20, 30 years in business now want to set up as consultants, but are finding that Gen X and boomer-led businesses are dying off, being replaced by millennial-led businesses. If not now, wait until 2033, only to find that senior leaders of that generation just don't have the receptors to deal with being sold consultancy or advice. They don't get it in the same way that Gen X and boomers do. What they do have is receptors for being sold building blocks of resources that can somehow be finagled into their business process, providing you let them work out how to do this themselves. This is why I believe we see so much more success in selling on outcomes than we used to, even though selling on outcomes is a very psychologically logical way to sell. Outcome-based selling is the same as selling building blocks, e.g. I will sell you a done-for-you social media marketing, e.g. I will sell you a dashboard for tracking and reporting your KPIs, or e.g. I will sell you a data protection officer as a service. So there's two options you have at the end of this video. One, everything I'm saying here is rubbish, and millennials being more representative of modern senior leadership teams has no impact on how you sell or what you sell because there's no apparent shifts caused by the introduction of the internet or changes in education to that community. Or two, some of us are boned. Let me know in the comments. So let me tell you a secret. I have something called the VIP program or the Very Important Founder program. There's a link in my bio where you can go and sign up. And when you do, you get access to free training, ebooks, checklists, exclusive content, all manner of resources that help you as a non-technology founder start and grow your technology business. Why don't you nip over to my bio, follow the link, sign up, and I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.